Good morning and good afternoon. It's the top of the hour. This is the development group conversation. The slides should be in the document and referenced there. Just waiting for some questions to start. And it looks like Sean has the first question. Sean, do you want to verbalize that?
I will do, thanks. I was trying to do the math real quick, but I didn't have time because we have 24 hires in development in Q2 already and 11 like in the pipeline, hopefully. But that still seems like it's lower than the 5 out of 6 in growth. So why is growth a particular area of challenge on the hiring front?
Yeah, so a couple things to specifically call out there. One is growth is our first foray into full stack hiring. So because of that, there's a little bit more overhead and process with getting that moving, just because, we got to make the evaluation. We also have a slightly different group of folks. What I'm specifically calling out is the fact that we'll hit 5 versus 6 of our target, where most of the other areas we look mostly on track. So that one's a little bit low, and that's also a priority for us. So that's why I'm also specifically calling out that one. The reason why we actually might hit slightly above 24 hires is a couple of reasons. One, we do have attrition, that happens, and we can always hire for that attrition. So we should be backfilling those positions. The other thing is when I did the accounting, I didn't account for the director hires, and we have effectively made 2 director hires in this quarter. The first one being Todd, who's our director of Secure, and also being interim director of Defend. And then we also have just signed this week a director of CI/CD, director of engineering CI/CD, I should say, to be more specific. But that is the one area that we'll probably monitor more closely than say the other areas from a hiring perspective.
Thanks, that makes sense.
Cool, and please verbalize the next question if you have one. If you don't, just to highlight a couple things. One, I did mention the Director of Engineering CI/CD hire. They're starting in the middle of August. We're super excited about that. Also to call out, which one was it I was thinking of? Basically some of our labeling that we're doing so we can better understand where we're spending our time associated with various MRs. We've also started to work on getting data over to Periscope. Thank you to Emily and the rest of the data team for helping us with that effort. And the last one is slide 9 is a miscellaneous, and a lot of that I pulled from the engineering weekend review, which I encourage everybody to read on a weekly basis because it's got a lot of good information in it. Cool, Daniel, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. Hey, Christopher. I was wondering how we were measuring the impact of enabling CD for our team.
That's a good question. I haven't really honestly thought about it. So to be frank, that hasn't been front and center on my mind. I would expect us to see some improvements in productivity. I would also expect us to see some definite improvements in our ability to respond and to effectively impact infrastructure. That you wouldn't necessarily see that in a development metric, but you would see that in a responsiveness to basic time associated with that. The classic answer also here is that you'll have a much tighter feedback cycle. So you would expect that teams like growth and potentially fulfillment teams would be very interested in having this capability just because of the fact of an immediate impact cycle associated with it. But I don't think I've quantified that yet from that perspective.
So if I may add to that, so Daniel, one of the things that we're looking at, so throughput is kind of a good way to see how often we're merging week to week. I would say the way I've communicated this to my managers is that CD's success is seeing merge our trend line sort of normalizing, and we're merging week to week more consistently. So this is not about merging a specific number. It's more that we're not merging at a spike one week versus the other weeks are much lower. So that's how I would use throughput. And then as Christopher mentioned, we're starting to build cycle time, or how long it takes to start an MR and get it all the way into production. So that new chart is in Periscope, and that'll tell us how long something like this. So CD success would be that our cycle time is shrinking significantly because we're not doing RCs and waiting to deploy them and so on. So those two measures should help us figure out how successful is our CD transition.
I'll also say, Daniel, if you have specific ideas about how we should be thinking about this, please share. Either here or in a future conversation, because we're always looking for input on these topics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that line of like how quickly it gets to our customers is the important one to measure against, sort of code complete and those gaps, code complete as opposed to actually done for our customers.
Cool. Next question, John, do you want to verbalize it?
Sure. So just had a question on how we measure throughput and whether, like we look at MRs and assume that all of those are created equally, or do we expect that they'll kind of average out to a similar value over the course of a month? Sean shared a great handbook link, so I think I have the answer to that question already, but would love to just kind of hear you explain it a little bit.
Yeah, this is a fairly classic computer science question. Why do you pick a measure like this and choose to optimize an organization around it? Kind of my take around it is in general, we're striving for the goal of per engineer 10 MRs per month on average. That's an average. That's not a high mark or a low mark from that perspective. So when you think about it in general, one of the things I think about is if you actually have an organization, statistically speaking, that just thinks in terms of smaller MRs, eventually what you do see is you see them getting roughly sized around the same amount. The one thing you don't want to do is force people arbitrarily to that position. You want to encourage them, but you don't necessarily want to force them arbitrarily to that position, just from the perspective of thinking, hey, we need to do these in smaller sizes, but we're not going to dictate like a specific size, because then that leads to all sorts of other, I'll call abnormal behaviors, which generally are viewed negatively from that perspective. I could pontificate about certain types of measures that have been used classically in computer science and software engineering that cause you to do those things. Cyclomatic complexity is one of those that I kind of think about in those terms.
Thanks very much.
No problem. Did anybody find the Easter egg in the slides? All right. I will share my screen real quick. So hopefully folks can see this. So if you notice this picture, it looks a little bit off. Todd with glasses, Todd without glasses.
Christopher, I have one question. So on the slide about growth to productivity challenge, we have an item that's crossed out. We are increasing project maintainers to allow code reviews to happen faster. Does that mean we don't want that to happen, or is it something we just haven't been done? It's under the caption what has been done, so, or what is being done. So what
yeah. Great question, Lucas. This is I really struggle with how to communicate this. So maybe you have a better suggestion. I'll look for it. So the previous slide talks a lot about the fact that at one point we had a hypothesis that part of the reason why our MR cycle time is going up is because of we don't have enough project maintainers, and we definitely want to keep our ratios low. In fact, you know, like if you said, Christopher, what should be our goal? You know, it's a somewhat still debated topic, but you know, ideally, I think in terms of somewhere around 4 to 1, potentially 4 maintainers to reviewers, potentially. You could see it being as high as 8, maybe, if you have a really active reviewer community, as an example, so that there's a little bit of reviewer versus how much are reviewers doing versus how much are maintainers reviewing. But you know, you do want to keep that ratio low. So the reason why I specifically called it out on this slide and striked it out is because it's still very much a activity, and the previous slide kind of talks to that, and the fact that we have an open MR and I'm holding one director accountable to basically keeping that ratio low. The one aspect is that it's not going to necessarily help the productivity challenge, because if you look at the previous slide, what you'll see is that we're not seeing it being a primary indicator of productivity change. Which sounds counterintuitive, I know, because I know a number of us have struggled with this, and you know, we definitely get feedback around this. So that's why we want to keep the count low, but it's not necessarily helping necessarily push our productivity.
Thank you.
No problem. And if you have a better suggestion of how I should have said that, grade it out or whatever, it's still very much an activity that we're doing. It's just not what's going to help drive that productivity aspect. Cool. And then Sean, you want to verbalize yours? Because you've done some good work here, and I really would love you to.
Yeah, just a quick thing. So one way we were measuring the ratio was just like a script in the website repo, so in the www.getlab.com repo, which is fine, but not great. Most of our charts are in Periscope, so I created an issue for this. I don't really know how to like get data into Periscope, but thankfully Taylor does, which is why he's on the data team and I'm not. And he's working on that. It's not a super high priority, I don't think, for anybody, but it'd be cool to get this in Periscope, to have it alongside the other charts, so that we can look at these all together, rather than like, you know, run a script somewhere, look at a chart in one place, look at a chart in another place. So yeah.
Cool. And I really want to encourage everybody to use Sean's example as a good way to kind of think about these things. I've seen this in a couple other places. We had a similar discussion around labeling, and Rachel in the issue actually kind of referenced a script that she created to basically go and check to see that, you know, if anything is unlabeled from a classification perspective, then that's a way for us to basically catch that and kind of do that. We're not exactly where we need to be, but we basically went back and kind of scrubbed May, and we reduced it, I think, from 400 down to 180 unlabeled issues. That's a discussion that we'll have later today in our metrics working group discussion, to kind of figure out how do we best get that, drive it towards zero from that perspective. Cool. In GitLab fashion, I'm not going to ask for less questions, because we don't ask for one more question. We just end the call. So given that there are no additional questions, I want to thank everybody for attending. And if you have any additional questions for me outside of this, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via Slack, email, issue, or Google documentation. Thanks, everybody.